Hi, my name is Sahir Mehta and welcome to the 14th edition of Tata Literature Live, the Mumbai Lit Fest, in association with the NCPA, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Safari, powered by Godrej and Kotak. Firstly, thank you so much for logging onto your laptops and finding us. We hope you're nice and comfortable, and if not, maybe it's time to buy a new couch. This is the final session of our online leg, and it promises to be an illuminating journey. History's most iconic spiritual figure, the Buddha, has long been revered. The wife he left behind, though, Princess Yashodhara, has oft been left behind by history as well. Today's book in focus, Mansions of the Moon, helps her catch up, shining a light on her story and through that lens exploring themes of power, marriage, and the different paths to enlightenment. Guiding us through this session is an award-winning Sri Lankan-Canadian author, known for his captivating storytelling and deep exploration of complex themes. He's the author of Funny Boy, The Hungry Ghosts, and the aforementioned Mansions of the Moon itself, Shyam Selvadurai. And joining him in conversation is Usha Subramanian, a former professor of English at Mitibai College, Mumbai, and now a respected freelance commentator known for insightful articles in different Indian publications. Now, if I may quote the Buddha himself, do not dwell on the past, do not dream of the future. Concentrate the mind on the present moment. Therefore, put your phones away and fully enjoy the conversation about to unfold before you. Unless you're watching this on your phone, in which case, please hold on to it, but put your notifications off. Thank you so much and enjoy.
It's a pleasure and a privilege, Shyam, to discuss with you your latest novel, Mansions of the Moon, published in 2022 after a long hiatus. For our viewers out there, Shyam's groundbreaking, award-winning debut novel was Funny Boy, and this was followed by two other equally well-acclaimed novels, Cinnamon Gardens and The Hungry Ghosts. Between the two, there was a well-received young adult fiction, Swimming in the Monsoon Sea. So all his novels hitherto have either won awards or have been shortlisted on a whole lot of awards. For a whole lot of awards. Now, coming to the present novel, Mansions of the Moon, this is a novel in the genre of historical fiction. It immerses us in the sights, sounds, and smells, as well as the socio-political and cultural structures of an ancient India dating back to 5th century BCE. Now, we all know that history is written and these days even rewritten by victors. Okay. And however, historical fiction gives an opportunity to retell this history from a marginalized perspective. So, characters that have been sidelined are brought into the mainstream. This is exactly what happens in Mansions of the Moon, where the well-known story of Siddhartha, his intellectual and spiritual journey, is narrated from the perspective of the far less visible Yashodhara, his wife. So, a footnote in history is made the protagonist. Now, this is also a tale of love, loss, and longing, of personal growth and self-discovery, as well as a novel of profound ideas. Thus, its appeal is to a wide spectrum of readers, young and old, Buddhists and non-Buddhists. Thank you, Shyam, for this extraordinary, unputdownable novel, for its vivid reimagining of the life of Siddhartha and Yashodhara, both before and after the Enlightenment. You have taken us to their childhood, a contrasting childhood, their domestic harmony, and then the relentless unraveling of this harmony thanks to his spiritual urges. Now, talking of spiritual urges, can you tell us what led you to Buddhism and inspired this particular exploration?
Well, I became interested in Buddhism myself in the early 2000s when in Sri Lanka I had a very ugly encounter with some security personnel, and I finally had to come to terms with the trauma of the Civil War. And I went to a regular, Western counselor, and she was very helpful. But after a bit, I hit a block, and I didn't know what it was until I'd read Karen Armstrong's biography, The Buddha. And I realized what was happening. The block was because my traumatized self wanted to change. It wanted to move on, and I wanted to closet it and hold it in its place and make it my identity. But it in itself wanted to change, and I was changing.
Okay.
And so from this idea came this my sort of commitment to Buddhism, because it acknowledges this fundamental change in this fundamental aspect of human or any existence, which is change and disintegration and regrowth, and how it offers a way that one might be happy and at peace in a world that's constantly changing. And so from there has come now a kind of series of novels that are probably I'm writing 2 more right now, and I think of them as Buddhist encounters and transformations.
Wow.
And so the Hungry Ghost looked at sort of these Buddhist concepts through sexuality, race, migration,
Yeah.
and so that was the first in it. And now this is the second, which is a historical novel, and then I've got 2 more, which is this children's fantasy novels, again looking at these very Buddhist concepts, or I would say almost South Asian concepts of change. And also as a writer, it's so exciting because you're so sort of overwhelmed by the Western tradition, which is a binary tradition, which is based on the Semitic religions, and here we have in our cultures this sort of non-binary religion that has all sorts of multiplicities in it. Right. And I wanted to try and bring those narrative tropes and plot ideas and character ideas that come out of these different philosophies into a more realist novel. Oh. Although in the next novel, I'm moving into kind of fantasy.
Okay. Fascinating. Now, you have said somewhere, I think in one of your interviews, that politics to fiction is like salt to food.
Yes.
Okay. That is, it's essential, but it should not be excessive, right? And just as you said, you yourself with your family, you're half Tamil, half Sri Lankan-Sinhalese, and your family had to flee Colombo in 1984 to escape the ethnic conflict between the 2 groups. Yes. Now, today, when we see the world around us, what we see is ethnic conflicts and religious nationalism on the rise, yes. Right? And yes. This is a novel, Mansions of the Moon, that passionately advocates the Buddhist philosophy of universal love, compassion, and tolerance, yes. Right? However, in an oration that the Buddha gives on love, it's a beautiful oration, and it answered a lot of my questions also, because he starts by saying, people have gone around saying that I don't believe in love. And then he gives this long oration on love. And he distinguishes good love from bad love. And this is what he or you, I don't know, have to say about bad love. Let me read just a couple of lines. This kind of love, that is the bad love, makes us discriminate and have prejudice, or just indifference to anyone we consider not me and mine, to anyone not of our family or gotra or race or nation. Are you striking a political note here?
Yes, I mean, in a sense, okay, so yes, of course, it's a political note, but I mean, the Buddha, Siddhartha now, the Buddha, is trying to negotiate his philosophy in a very imperfect world in which there are, his father is trying to now use him for political gain, and he's resisting this as the Buddha. And he's also trying to talk to Yashodhara. He's really addressing Yashodhara through this talk, even though it's directed to everybody, right. Saying that, you have to learn to love beyond me and mine. And of course, she rejects it right away. But then at some point, she asks herself, in the context of her son, is it actually possible for me as a mother to love my son beyond me and mine? And then that question then pushes forward the last part of the novel for her. So yes, my novels always do have politics, and because power is very much a concept that leads to unhappiness and leads to dukkha, this idea in Buddhism, and it's because of greed and hatred and delusion that is so much connected to any power structure, anybody using power. And so yes, it is very much a part of Buddhism, and it is this kind of attempt by Siddhartha in the novel to escape that his role as a prince, as the 1% of his time, and he keeps complaining constantly throughout the novel that he's nothing but a fly stuck in the honeypot of power.
Right.
And he's the first one to unstick himself from it. And in his unsticking himself, he's able to help everybody, including his own father, unstick themselves through and free themselves from it. But it is always happening in an imperfect world in which there are many competing elements. And Yashodhara, because has this fierce intelligence and awareness of power and politics, is able to see that, and so is able to find her own way of unsticking herself, which is taking from her husband, but also her own path.
Yes.
And a woman's path in a way as well. The women have their path.
Yeah, we'll come to the women very soon. Okay. Now, in its reconstruction and literary reimagining of the Buddha story, how is your novel different from previous attempts?
Well, I mean, we live in a different era. So the earlier Yashodhara novels are based on this concept of South Asian women as empty vessels, people possessing none of their own individual thoughts, feelings, and volition. They must just be empty vessels to be filled with male volition, whether it's their fathers, their brothers, their husbands, and so on. And this concept comes from a particular period in South Asian history when women were particularly oppressed. But what's interesting, if you go back beyond that period, you come across these women like the women in the Buddhist Pali canon, like, for example, Draupadi, who are women who have a lot of agency and intelligence and ability to see themselves and to speak for themselves. And so I was going back to that model to kind of create this character. So in that sense, she does resonate with us as modern readers, but she's not anachronistic. She's not a feminist. Absolutely. I haven't turned to Western feminism for Yashodhara. I have gone back beyond that terrible period in our history to find these other women, and she is them in a way. And she, because she also has, she has the qualities of South Asian women in spirituality, for example. Spirituality is an important aspect of her. She worships this deva in this tree that she thinks is, and so there's this, I really felt that spirituality needed to be part of her, and that if it wasn't part of her, then she's an anachronism. Then I'm trying to cast her in a kind of Western secular feminist mode, which I didn't want her to be. I wanted her to feel real of her time.
Okay. In fact, you have already preempted and answered another question of mine, which was going to refer to Yashodhara in a big way. She's such a multi-dimensional character, as you pointed out. She's daughter, sister, mother, wife, friend, cousin, and so much more rolled into one. And I wanted to ask you, how much was indebted to research and how much to your own imagination? But I guess you've already answered the question.
Well, I have answered it in a way, Usha, because yes, I have talked about the research, but ultimately you as a writer have to find your way into a character. And I always have this piece of advice I give my creative writing students, which is that if it's a character who's really quite far from you, the best thing to do is to find a part of yourself that's really essential to you and give it to that character. And that's what I did with Yashodhara, because she has this, like me, she has this inner private self that is very important to her sense of being.
Right.
And why she likes or why she loves Siddhartha is that he's a man who also has his own private self, and he won't do what most men would do to a woman like her, which is to push their way in and stamp themselves in her private self. And people who have these private selves, like me, tend, even if they are in very loving spousal relationships, at the same time, because they have this private self, they tend to have a multiplicity of people who they have very important relationships with them. So they have this multiplicity because a part of them is not connected to the spouse. They're not committed to a single person. And Yashodhara has this. She has her brother. She has that wonderful relationship with her two cousins, particularly with Ananda, with the women in her life, her mother and her aunt. So I just felt like once I had given her that part of myself, she was going to become the other parts of myself as well.
Oh, lovely, lovely. Now, another thing, I think I'm right when I say that the meaning of your novels begins right from the title, right? Because each title, whether it is Funny Boy, funny because of his difference in sexuality, The Hungry Ghost, of course, the whole novel is built around that Pretya and the thing, and Cinnamon Gardens, talking about a particular class of people, etc., to establishes them already. Similarly, Mansions of the Moon is also a speaking title. It's very poetic, almost romantic. But another title that intrigued me when reading this novel was, your novel has been divided into 3 sections.
Yes.
And all 3 sections are uniformly titled Dukka, which you have explained somewhere and in fact it's explained in the novel, it is sorrow. In fact, Yashodhara herself says, what is Siddhartha going on about Dukka? I don't understand. That Dukka is, understanding that is the source of wisdom, because it can mean minor annoyances and irritants, as well as the very angst of existence. So can you throw light on the title of your novel and the section titles?
Well, I mean, I wanted to, so you have these past sections and then you have the present day sections. So the present day sections are titled Dukka, and the past sections have other titles like, A Woman Eaten, Froth on the River. They're all titles that come from sort of a philosophical thing.
But
Dukka means, as you've explained, it means this it's contextual in terms of suffering. And so I'm trying to show how Yashodhara is trying in her own way to deal with the various changes and difficulties in her life. But at the Buddha says that at the base of dukkha is our inability to accept change. And that what Buddhism offers you is a chance to come to peace with this. And so you cannot change your physical pain, obviously, but you can be at peace with it until it passes or you pass with it. I mean, so I think that's probably where I'm playing with the title.
Okay, thank you. Yes, the novel does embody the anguish of change as well as of loss. And interestingly, Siddhartha largely contemplates and intellectualizes and theorizes this anguish, while it is Yashodhara who actually experiences and lives it, right? And there is a very meaningful exchange early on in the novel, almost their first one, I would think, on this subject, where Yashodhara's life is being uprooted for the first time, and she vehemently protests against it to Siddhartha. So here is an exchange between them when they have to leave the palace life and go to a remote northern province to a totally new, unknown future. Would you please read that out for our reader? For our
viewers? So, yes. And so now she has just overheard him talking to her father and saying how much he's looking forward to the challenges of this new position. So she's now furious, and he says, "I'm sorry, Ushas." He squatted beside her and rested an arm on her shoulder. "I just found out too about the voyage." But she was not fooled by his attempt to be downcast. It's all very well for you. You're excited by this new posting. He started to protest, but she cut him short. Yes, I just heard you talking to my Peter. He looked at her guilty. Whereas for me, this is exile from Ramagama, from my Amme, my Peter, Devadatta, the civilized world. She waved her hand to encompass their suite. Soon I will not know any of this. I would never have chosen the northern province if I'd been given a choice. But I have no choice either, my Peter. No, but you've got something that excites you. Don't you dare pretend otherwise. Siddhartha was silenced. Well, he said after a moment, rather sullen, would you like me to turn down the position? Oh, don't be so silly. Then what? What would you like, Ushas? She gave a massive shrug and turned away from him. An empty seed pod, that's all I am. An empty seed pod carried along by any river current. Why, a Garnica has more say in her life than I do. Yes, a Garnica, she cried at his look of bewilderment.
Excellent. Thank you. Now, this chapter is aptly titled A Woman's Lot. Yes. And the seed pod analogy keeps recurring, and it effectively captures the women's lot in an oppressive patriarchy. Yes. Now, all your novels have very strong, memorable women characters.
Yes.
And here, the treatment of the women's lot in this novel is not merely captivating, but also very, very empathetic. Where does this empathy come from? I'm curious.
Well, people have always asked me that, how do I as a man inhabit women so well? I think it's partly because when you're gay, women tell you things. You have these very intense friendships with women friends, or even with my sisters. And so they feel free to tell you things that they would never tell anybody else, maybe not even other women, such as like, okay, I hate my child right now. I would like to strangle him, and so they feel like they can say this to you, and you can. So I kind of, I have that sense of feeling about it. And also I think I understand myself what it's like to be silenced and what it's like to have to try and force who you are into silence, but also how the greater society makes so many decisions for you in your life, and you can resist, but sometimes you are simply carried along by it. So that's where it comes from. But what's interesting is that Yashodhara keeps saying, I am this empty seed pod carried along. And her mother says, but a seed pod isn't empty. It's full of seed. It goes down the river to propagate itself somewhere else. And so the mother's response to what Yashodhara says becomes also kind of self-fulfilling in the novel.
So when you say, I remember the mother telling her, we are not just empty seed pods, we do, which means this kind of subversive ways in which the women counter patriarchy.
Yes.
You might see them as empty seed pods, but meanwhile, they're actually propagating themselves.
Yes.
Right? So what are some of the subversive elements you have introduced in this novel?
Well, I mean, to start with, there is Yashodhara's fierce intelligence. Her ability to see things more clearly than Siddhartha before he becomes the Buddha. She sees it clearly, and she sees his blind spots quicker than he does. And so this is subversive in the concept of women as having no thoughts and feelings of their own.
Right.
Then I'm trying to talk about it without giving away the end of the novel. Then her and the women's ability to in the women's quarters find a way to come to each other outside of all the quarreling and bickering and power dynamics which have actually been imposed on them by the male patriarchal order. Their unhappiness comes from there, the various unhappinesses, and there is a way in which the women learn to negotiate a space for themselves in the novel. I'm trying to say it now without giving away the novel.
Right. That's right. I got it. Now, Moving on to the other important character, in fact, he's supposed to be the more important character, Siddhartha Gautama. He has always been the hero, of course, indisputable, undisputed hero of his own story, of his own
Yes.
spiritual journey, right? But here he's being seen through the eyes of his wife. And we do detect some fatal flaws. And there are many moments in the novel when Yashodhara rebukes him, accuses him of being a cold husband and an uncaring father, right? And his relationship with his own father is a very fractured one, right? So he could so easily have become the antagonist in this novel. However, by the end of the novel, the reader, like Yashoda, falls under his spell, is embraces or swayed by his middle way, and his spirituality ultimately trumps everything. My
Yes.
question to you is, how did you manage to take us to these dark places and then bring us up to the light, effecting a catharsis in a truly classical sense?
Well, I mean, the journey of creating Siddhartha was for me a long one, because initially I sort of thought the easiest way would be to make him seem very um, not very nice, and that she would but then I thought, that's kind of, firstly, the poor writing choice, the obvious writing choice. Secondly, it doesn't make sense that such a man would have come up with this philosophy of compassion. So instead of which, I made him very loving and sensitive and warm, and he really does love her. He
Yes,
really
yes,
loves her, and she really loves him, and they are soulmates,
right,
connected, as he says later, through many lives. But what's ruthless is his calling. His calling is the thing that's ruthless. And again, as an artist, I know what that means. I know how your vocation, your calling, trumps everything else in such a way that you do have to push towards it, no matter the collateral damage, because to not do that is to die inside. And once you realize, as Siddhartha realizes, that he's dying inside, he has to do this. So I think that that's where the sympathy for him comes from in the novel. But in the end, it is her story, and she and her son Rahula are the collateral damage of
right.
finding the Dhamma. And in fact, Siddhartha says that to Rahula. He says, when Rahula accuses him of everything he's done, he says, he never denies it. He says, yes, you're right. And you can never accept my doing it unless you accept that what I brought back from this period of contemplation was worth it. And Rahula says, I will never accept it.
Yes,
As a starting point, I will never
right,
accept it. So in a sense, I'm leaving it to the reader as well to kind of enter into these thoughts and gray areas, because I think that's really what a novel should do. A
right,
novel is not a polemical work. A novel is asking questions that are complex, moral and ethical questions that are complex, but leaving enough room for the reader themselves to make decisions based often on themselves and what they would value. So in that sense, there is what I would call a lot of white spaces in the
right.
novel that are good, because they allow the reader to come into the novel and work themselves and work within it themselves.
Right, right. That's what happened with me when I read the novel. Actually, I think you've succeeded in that.
Thank you.
Now, this is a novel that's it's at one level it's an enthralling tale, okay, really gripping, but it's also a highly philosophical novel with ideas that do require a certain degree of maturity to respond to. Now, this is a novel that was published in 2022 when the world was just nervously, cautiously emerging out of a global pandemic. A global pandemic that was a real leveler and also turned all lives upside down. And the mantra that went around, not just the management mantra, but the human mantra was the only constant in life is change, right? Now, did this pandemic in any way influence your writing? And the other question is, do you think in a post-pandemic world, the ideas that your novel carries will have a greater resonance, not just with the older people, but also with the youth?
Well, I mean, I finished the book just as the pandemic started. I mean, my editor
Oh,
held it because they didn't want to bring it out during the pandemic, and we
okay.
edited it in that time. But obviously, what Siddhartha said, in 600 BC
Yes.
is a fact of
So
life.
relevant. Yeah.
He was just naming a fact of life. Change occurs. During the pandemic, we were even more conscious of this change that was occurring. It was just that what was always there was suddenly more conscious, and people reacted to it based on who they were. Um, and so, in a post-pandemic world, it's difficult for me to say what it has to offer. I mean, in the sense that the world is so constantly changing that it just seems like, now we are in these extreme situations. Extremism is so much on the rise everywhere in the world, wherever you look, and hatred and sort of wishing violence on people who are usually helpless, minorities often. And so it's just this question of, and self-congratulation by people who are doing this. There's a sort of self-congratulation of these haters have found a way to self-congratulate themselves even as they do this. So I mean, Buddhism has so much, the novel has so much to say about it that but I'm not writing. I couldn't have written for this moment, but I'm writing about the creation of this philosophy that is eternal and that has lasted through time, but has been reinterpreted in various ways throughout its long history in order to address current reality. And
Yeah.
you yourself, as an individual, can do that with Buddhism. It offers you that.
Oh, okay. Now, coming to some stylistic features, your novel, uh, when I talk about the structure of the novel, it starts in medias res, in the middle of the things, and then you use flashback to bring the reader up to the present, right? Now, is this an influence of the Western epic traditions or older Buddhist traditions?
It is the older Buddhist traditions, which always start with the what's called the frame story. Somebody comes to the Buddha and says, "This has happened," and then he says, "Well, the reason it's happening is in their past life they did this and this," and then at the end you come back to the present life. So I've used that structure now also in the Hungry Ghost, and so what it does is it creates something called dramatic irony, so that the reader is reading with an understanding of something that's already happened. So they're reading oddly in a more contemplative, philosophical way because they already know what happens. So the question then becomes not what happens, but how it happens.
Okay.
And as a writer, it requires you to work extra hard because you can no longer get away with what happened. You have to work on how it happened and make that intriguing enough so that the reader will keep reading. Because anyways, everybody knows the Buddha story.
Very often you kind of start with what happened and then you go to how it happened.
Yes.
Right. Yes.
Because anyways, a lot of readers would know the Buddha story. So for me to start with him just as Siddhartha Gautama, the reader already has that dramatic irony because they're already looking from the present. But I wanted to emphasize that in a way.
Okay. You have also used other narrative devices from earlier Buddhist writers, and you have said that you've always admired them, hence the imitation, and you are using them in your own fiction more because they're sophisticated and not to inject an exotic or oriental coloring, right? Yeah. Now, when I was just looking up about, some references on you, etc., there was a very interesting phrase used by, I think, a Canadian critic, saying that one of the appeals of your fiction is that they found it like literary aromatherapy. Okay, so my question is, this what are the dangers of orientalizing a novel such as this in the West? Because for me,
Yeah.
it definitely was not literary aromatherapy. It was far, far superior to that. But what has the reception to this aspect been in the West?
Well, I mean, Usha, you can't control how people are going to read your novel. That
Right,
I realize, you
right,
have to let that go as a writer. I am the kind of writer who, in order to excel or to reach my highest standard within myself, needs to imagine a reader, and that reader has to also be at the highest standard, so that that imagined reader, keeps me on track, keeps me, it's like a personal, like a fitness coach. That reader keeps me going, keeps me,
okay,
so I don't really think um about the other readers. I don't think about the lesser readers, because if I think about the lesser readers, I'm going to write a lesser novel. So that has always been my standard from the beginning of how to approach the process of writing. And so how it's then received is always is surprising, to say the least. Both a good surprising and bad surprising. And
okay.
I think you just have to, especially if you claim to be a Buddhist or interested in Buddhism, accept this. And I think also in accepting that, then it frees me up to be the best possible writer I can possibly be.
Right, right. So, whom are you writing for then?
Well, I mean, this book was written to people. Well, I think to me, it was written to a South Asian reader. And you can see that simply in the fact that I use Pali as the other language, so
Right.
that the South Asian reader would feel some words were familiar, some words were
Yeah,
foreign.
yeah.
So they'd feel a kind
Yeah,
of,
cognate, so we could
yeah,
get
coordinate.
together.
Because if I was
Right.
writing it to a Western reader, I could use Hindi, Urdu, Gujarati. Nobody would have known the difference,
Right.
or Sinhala. So I think that I wanted to say something like, look, let's look at this story again, and let's look at it in a Buddhist way. Let's look at this a remarkable woman, and let's look at her story in a Buddhist way. And I'm inviting the reader in to have that, to feel that experience of change through reading the novel, because that's what those Buddhist stories do. They move beyond the intellectual ideas to the realm of feeling, and how feeling itself the narratives create a sense of feeling that then tie in to the intellectual ideas of Buddhism. So that's sort of what I was going for. And of course, I was very excited to relook at South Asian women's history.
Okay, 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 right. Um, Now, the river is a central metaphor of your novel. You also have the netted birds, right?
Yes,
There are
yes,
other analogies and things, but the river is a constant metaphor. If I would think it kind of exemplifies life itself with its, a lack of control as well as constant movement and
yeah,
change and no going back, etc. Now, in the last section, in almost one of the last chapters, seed pods, interestingly named seed pods, you
yeah,
have a whole lot of orations, another Buddhist narrative device, and this largely by, I mean, almost all of them by women, right?
yes,
And there is one oration which makes explicit this metaphor of the river. And
yes,
this is by Mita, who is Yashodhara's cousin. Would you
yes,
please read that for our
yes.
viewers?
With pleasure. With pleasure. She's one of my. I love her as a character. I love the way she evolves and grows. She's one
Yeah.
of those characters I grew very fond of. Mita frowns, staring at the earth, tapping it with a finger while she gathers her thoughts. Finally, she looks up and begins in the traditional way of orators and storytellers, saying, "This I have heard, Mitto. A woman thinking a river to be calm and peaceful enters it with a blissful mind, intending to cleanse and rejuvenate herself. Yet, the moment she waded into the water, she gets caught in a strong current beneath the surface and is swept along. Helpless, she watches as the surge carries her downstream. Helpless, she watches her clothes on the bank become specks in the distance. After some time, however, the river narrows, the banks are much closer, and she sees that there is grass, sawgrass, reeds, creepers, and bushes all hanging into the river. As she goes past the grass, she tries to cling to it, but it breaks off in her hands. She clings to the sawgrass next, but it cuts her hand. She clings to the creeper, even the bushes, but they give way, and she is carried along by the river to her inevitable end. So it is with us, Mito. For the river is the worldly life into which we enter, seeking comfort, only to be swept along towards our death. The grass, which is physical forms of all kinds, our loved ones, our wealth, breaks because it's the nature of physical things to break and wear out and age and be lost, including our own bodies. The sawgrass with its knife-sharp edges represents our feelings, and they cut us, causing us such great suffering. The creepers are slippery and also break easily. They are human activity, which produces no permanent result or effect that we can grasp on to and prevent ourselves being swept along the river of life to our inevitable death. And the bush, which is surely the strongest of the plants along the shore, also cannot be clung to because it comes out at the roots. The bush is our consciousness that is always with us and appears so permanent, but yet also dies with our bodies.
Yeah, that's beautiful, really, because it gives us, the whole thing. And there's another one also, Yashodhara's Dream.
Yes.
She explains that, right? So,
Yes.
I mean, I can go on and on and on, especially I wanted you to read almost the whole of the opening pages with its explosive start, where Yashodhara's reaction to the return of the Siddhartha is, I wish he were dead. I mean,
Yes.
that's such an explosive start. After that, you just can't put the novel down. You have to find out what happens, right? Thank you, Shyam. I mean, it's been a wonderful exchange. At least I've enjoyed every moment of it.
Me
Your
too.
insightful answers have only further, I mean, I think I'll go back and read it with all this in my mind. And I'm glad that we don't have to wait for another decade before we can discuss your next novel, because you said there are already two more in the pipeline. Earlier, you have had quite long intervals between the novels.
I know, Usha.
Right?
I'm a slow writer and I get distracted by doing stuff in Sri Lanka. I mean, I can't resist working with students there, and then it takes up my time. And next thing I know, I can't write a novel for a
So you
while.
are
So
more, you spend more time in Sri Lanka than in Toronto these days?
I spend 3 or 4 months in Sri Lanka every year, and then there was years when I lived there as well when I was curator of the Galle Literary Festival. So I'm deeply connected to Sri Lanka, but also committed to it being the best thing it can possibly be. So I have a deep love for the country, and no
Oh,
matter what happens, no matter what's done to me, I still have this love of it, and
I
it's
can
just there. I
understand.
accept
I
it
can
now. Yeah,
understand. After
yeah,
all, roots.
yes.
Okay. And this depiction of Siddhartha has not in any way disturbed the conservative elements there.
Doesn't seem to have so far, but
Thank
life is
God.
very unpredictable. So
Hmm.
I mean, but I think it is a very it's a more modern portrait of I was looking at him through eyes, but it's very sympathetic, and it also more important is very Buddhist. It's a very Buddhist story.
Yeah, it
So
is. It is.
yeah,
My only
yeah,
question was, these days, anyone who's revered by anyone, we dare not say anything about them.
yeah,
Okay, so that's the climate we are living in, where everything is banned. Banning is easiest to do.
yeah,
So I'm really happy to learn that in no way has this impacted,
no,
the reception of the
has
novel in your own country. And to the viewers out there, all of you listening to this exchange, I hope it has aroused enough curiosity and eagerness for you to go and grab your copy of the book. This is an engrossing as well as a highly thought provoking novel. And I think everyone should keep a copy of it own it, read and reread, especially when you feel most disturbed by life. I think this can be a very good place to go to. Yeah. So grab your copy and you will not regret it. You'll be richly rewarded. So thank you, Shyam, again for a lovely conversation.
Thank you, Usha, for
All the
some
best.
wonderful questions and a really wonderful conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wow, what a lovely session. Thank you so much, Usha and Shyam, for a truly insightful conversation. And thank you for joining us. If I may also take this opportunity to thank our sponsors, title sponsor Tata, in association with the NCPA, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Safari, powered by Godrej and Kotak. We hope to also see you for the in-person section of our fest at the NCPA St. Paul's Institute and Tidal Waves from the 27th to the 29th of October. Now, depending on what time you saw this, good morning, good afternoon, or good night.